People keep asking me why I didn't lose it, why I didn't raise my voice, throw something, or at least say something I regret. And every time I give them the same answer, because I didn't need to. What I did instead was worse. For them anyway. Let me back up. I'd been in Columbus for 4 days. A work thing. Not my work anymore. I retired 2 years ago. But my old company had a transition issue with a client I'd spent 15 years building a relationship with, and they asked me to fly out and help close the gap. My wife, Helen, told me to go. She said, "Ray, you spent 31 years with those people. You go help them." That was Helen. Always thinking about other people before herself. Always. So I went. And I wasn't supposed to come back until Thursday. But Wednesday morning I woke up at 4:30 and I couldn't sleep. Something felt off. I don't know how to explain it without sounding like I'm trying to make this into something mystical, because I'm not. I'm a 62-year-old man who spent his career in supply chain logistics. I don't believe in signs, but something in me was unsettled, and I called Helen around 6:30 and she didn't answer. That was strange. Helen always had her phone on. She'd had a blood pressure issue for about 3 years. Nothing critical. Her cardiologist had her on medication and she managed it well. But we'd agreed a long time ago that we always answer each other's calls. Always. I called again at 7. Nothing. I texted. Nothing. By 7:30 I was on the phone with the airline rescheduling my flight. I told myself I was overreacting. That she'd probably left her phone in the other room, or she was in the shower, or she'd gone for a walk. I told myself that. I kept telling myself that the entire cab ride to the airport, the entire flight home, the entire drive from the airport. Our house is in a neighborhood in East Tennessee, not a big house, 3 bedrooms, the kind of place where you know your neighbor's cars. When I pulled into the driveway at just past 2 in the afternoon, I noticed my son's truck parked on the street, and there was another car behind it I didn't recognize. I thought, good, he's here with his mother. I will spend the rest of my life wishing I hadn't been so naive. I used my key. I pushed open the front door, and the first thing I heard was laughter. Loud, comfortable laughter. The kind of laughter that belongs at a backyard barbecue, not inside someone's house. It was coming from the direction of the kitchen. I almost called out. I almost said, "I'm home." But then I looked to my right. Helen was on the living room floor. She was lying near the coffee table, half curled on her side, her hand pressed to the side of her face. There was blood on her fingers, not a lot, not the kind that looks like a scene from a movie, but enough. A dark smear on her cheek, a thin line near her temple. Her eyes were open and she was crying. Not loudly. Quietly. The way someone cries when they've been crying for a while and don't have anything left. She looked up at me and said, "You're home." Like she'd given up on that possibility. I was at her side in 3 seconds. I knelt down and I took her hand and I said, "I'm here. I'm right here." I asked her what happened, where she was hurt, how long she'd been on the floor. She said she'd been dizzy, lost her balance, hit the edge of the table. Her head had caught the corner. That's where the blood was coming from, a cut just above her right ear. She said her neck hurt and her knee. She said she'd called out, but no one came. She said she'd been there for almost 40 minutes. 40 minutes. I want you to sit with that number for a moment. 40 minutes on the floor, bleeding, calling for help, while laughter echoed from 20 feet away. I called 911 while I was still kneeling beside her. I kept my voice steady. I gave the address, described the injury, described her blood pressure history. The dispatcher told me not to move her until the paramedics arrived. I held her hand. I kept talking to her, not about anything important, just about the flight, about the weather in Columbus, about the way the maple tree in the front yard was starting to turn. Anything to keep her focused on my voice. The laughter in the kitchen had stopped. I heard footsteps. My son, his name is Brendan, he's 29, appeared in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room. He looked at his mother on the floor, had been crouched beside her, and the expression on his face was not horror. It was not panic. It was something closer to inconvenience. He said, "Oh, when did you get back?" I looked at him for a long moment. I said, "Call the rest of them out here." He didn't move right away. I said it again, quietly. He turned and said something toward the kitchen. Two people walked out. A man I recognized, my son's father-in-law. His name is Clint. Clint and his wife, a woman named Merrill, had been at our house twice before. Holiday dinners. They'd always been polite enough, but there was something transactional about them that I'd never fully trusted. And behind Clint was someone I'd never seen. A younger man, maybe late 30s, in a button-down shirt with a leather portfolio under his arm. I didn't ask who he was yet. I looked at Clint and I said, "My wife has been on this floor for 40 minutes. He nodded slowly. He said, "We heard her, but Brendan said she just needed a minute, that this happens sometimes with her blood pressure." I processed that. Brendan had known. Brendan had heard his mother call out and made a decision, for the people sitting at his parents' kitchen table, that she just needed a minute. I turned back to Helen. She squeezed my hand. I squeezed my hand. I squeezed back. The paramedics arrived 11 minutes later. Two of them came through the front door I'd left open. They moved efficiently, checked her pupils, her blood pressure, the cut on her head, ran through a series of questions. Her blood pressure was elevated. The cut needed attention. They stabilized her and got her on a stretcher. The whole time Brendan and Clint and Merrill and the man with the portfolio were standing in the living room watching. I walked the paramedics to the door. I talked with them in the entryway. They told me she'd be okay. The cut wasn't deep enough for stitches, just a butterfly bandage. But her blood pressure needed to come down, and they recommended we follow up with her cardiologist by end of day. They gave me paperwork. I thanked them. I closed the door. Then I turned around. There were 4 people in my living room. My son, his father-in-law, his mother-in-law, and a stranger with a portfolio. I stood there for a moment and I just looked at them. I wasn't deciding what to say. I had already decided. I was just letting them feel the weight of the silence first. I looked at the man I didn't know and I said, "Who are you?" His name was Todd. He was a real estate attorney. He had driven 2 hours from Nashville, and then Clint started talking. The story came out in pieces and I had to pull some of it together myself later, but here is what I understood within the first 10 minutes. Clint had found out, through some loose talk at a family gathering, that I had been considering selling an acre of land I owned on the other side of town. It was a plot I'd purchased about 18 years ago as an investment, undeveloped, sitting at the edge of what had turned into a fairly desirable corridor. I had, at one point, mentioned to Brendan that I might sell it when I retired. Clint had taken that to mean the land was essentially already Brendan's. He had spent, apparently, the better part of 3 months arranging for a private buyer, someone he knew through his own business connections, and he had brought Todd, the attorney, to my house while I was out of town, to have Brendan sign documents that would authorize the listing of the property under a power of attorney arrangement that Clint had apparently prepared without my knowledge. Brendan did not own that land. Brendan had no power of attorney over anything of mine, but they had planned to use the meeting at my home, my address, my house, my environment, to create paperwork that looked official enough to move forward. I listened to all of this. I let Clint talk. He was performing confidence, but underneath it I could see the moment he realized he miscalculated the day this was going to happen. When he was finished, I said, "You drove 2 hours to commit fraud in my living room." He started to explain. I held up one hand. He stopped. I looked at Brendan, my son, my 29-year-old son who I had co-signed a lease for, covered health insurance for beyond the age it made any sense to, handed money to when he and his wife were short, bought a truck for, then 100 things for because I wanted him to have a foundation that I didn't have when I was starting out. I said, "You knew your mother was on that floor." He said, "Dad, she said she was fine." I said, "Brendan, you knew she was on that floor." He didn't say anything else. I turned to Clint and Merrill. I said, "You have about 90 seconds to get everything you brought into this house and walk out that door. If I see any of those documents again, I'll be calling the county clerk and my attorney by morning." Clint looked at me. Then he looked at Brendan. Then he picked up the portfolio from where Todd had set it on my coffee table. On the same coffee table my wife's blood was still on. And he and Merrill walked out. Todd followed without a word. I watched the door close. Then I looked at my son. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. because I think people assume it was rage. It wasn't. I know what my rage feels like. It's hot and fast, and it makes me stupid. What I felt right then was something colder and much more clear. It was grief with the warmth taken out of it, grief with its mind made up. I said, "Sit down." He sat. I sat across from him, and I talked, slowly, the way I used to talk to him when he was 7 years old and had done something I needed him to actually understand. I told him that I had spent 29 years building things for him, not giving him things, building things. A foundation, relationships. I reminded him of the people I had introduced him to over the years, the ones who'd helped him get his first real job, the contractor who'd given him work when he was between positions, the banker who'd approved his first personal loan because my name was behind it. I told him that every one of those threads ran through me. I told him that his father-in-law had walked into my house and attempted to execute a fraudulent real estate transaction, and that Brendan had let him in, had sat at the kitchen table and laughed while his mother bled on the living room floor. I said, "You have to understand what I'm about to do. I'm not doing it because I'm angry. I'm doing it because I need you to feel what decisions actually cost." I called my bank that afternoon. I removed Brendan from the emergency contact line, canceled the secondary card I'd extended to him 3 years ago for just-in-case expenses, and asked for a full review of recent transactions. There were charges I hadn't approved, small enough that they'd slipped past me, dozens of them over 8 months. Nothing dramatic, just a slow, quiet bleed. I called the leasing office for the apartment where Brendan and his wife lived. I was a co-signer on their lease. I informed them in writing that I was initiating the removal of my name from the agreement at the earliest legally available window. Their next renewal was in 4 months. I called a friend of mine who ran a mid-size manufacturing company and who had given Brendan a vendor referral last year that had turned into real income. I didn't tell him everything. I just told him things had changed at home and that I'd be stepping back from any professional introductions for the foreseeable future. He understood. He'd known me long enough to read between the lines. I didn't touch Brendan's health insurance that day. He was on his own company's plan by then, so there was nothing to touch. But I called the insurance broker who managed my family's umbrella policy and asked him to walk me through what I was still carrying on Brendan's behalf. There was a life insurance rider I'd been paying premiums on for 6 years. I discontinued it. Each call took about 10 minutes, some less. I sat at the desk in my home office, door closed, and I made them one after another. Methodical, not angry, just accounting. When I was done, I sat quietly for a few minutes. Then I went back to the bedroom. Helen was in bed. The butterfly bandage was above her ear. She had color in her face. Her blood pressure had come down. She looked at me when I walked in. That particular look she has, that means she's been listening to me move around the house and tracking where I am by sound, the way she's done for 31 years. I sat on the edge of the bed. She didn't say anything for a moment. Neither did I. Then she said, "How bad is it?" I said, "It's handled." She said, "Brendan?" I said, "He knows what he did. He knows what it cost." She was quiet again. Then she reached over and put her hand on mine. I turned mine over and held it. Her fingers were cold, the way they always are in the afternoon. I'd been warming her hands up for 31 years. I think about that a lot now. About how some things are so ordinary they become invisible. Holding someone's cold hand, answering a phone call, coming home, and how you don't understand what those small things actually are until something threatens to remove them. Brendan called 2 days later. I let it go to voicemail. He called again the day after that. I listened to the message. He said he was sorry. He said he didn't know it had gone that far with his father-in-law. He said he'd been caught in the middle and hadn't known how to handle it. I didn't call back. Not because I'll never speak to my son again. I don't know what this looks like in a year. I don't know what it looks like in 5. What I know is that an apology delivered before the consequences have fully arrived is not really an apology. It's damage control. And I've spent 31 years in logistics. I know the difference between someone managing their exposure and someone who's genuinely understood what went wrong. When Brendan understands, when he can sit across from me and tell me, without prompting, exactly what he chose in that moment and why it was wrong, not just that it upset me, but why it was wrong, then we'll talk. I spoke with my attorney the following week. I updated my estate documents. The land stays in a trust. The trust goes to Helen and, after Helen, to a charitable fund I've been contributing to for years. A vocational training program for men coming out of the corrections system. Men who are learning to start from nothing and build something real. I've always believed in it. It felt right to make it formal. My attorney asked me if I was sure about the changes. I told him I was more sure than I'd been about anything in a long time. Helen came with me to her cardiologist follow-up. Her numbers were good. The doctor adjusted one of her medications slightly and told her to reduce her sodium, which she's been hearing for 3 years and which she takes about as seriously as she takes advice to slow down in general, which is to say not very. But she was okay. She is okay. She is okay. We drove home and she asked me if I wanted to stop for lunch. We went to a diner we've been going to since before Brendan was born. She ordered the patty melt. I ordered coffee and pie and pretended I wasn't going to eat half her fries, which she pretended to believe. There is something I want to say to anyone who's been in a version of this situation, not as advice. I'm not in the business of telling other people what to do. Just an observation. When I walked into that house and found Helen on the floor, I had 2 options. I could have let what I felt in that moment drive everything that came after. The fury, the disbelief, the kind of grief that wants to break something. That would have been understandable, maybe even satisfying for about 48 hours. But I knew, I've always known this about myself, that the moments when I feel the most justified in losing control are exactly the moments I can least afford to. Because when you lose control, you hand the narrative over. You become the unstable one, the one who overreacted, and suddenly the conversation is about your behavior instead of theirs. I kept the narrative. I didn't raise my voice once. Not to Clint, not to Brendan, not to anyone. I spoke clearly and I moved deliberately, and I did what needed to be done with the kind of patience that, honestly, took everything I had. But it was enough. Some evenings now I sit on the back porch with Helen after dinner. She drinks decaf. I don't drink anything because I never quite got into the habit of evening drinks, and at 62 I figure it's too late to start. We watch the yard go dark. Sometimes we talk. Sometimes we talk. Sometimes we don't. Last week she said, out of nowhere, "I knew you were coming." I asked her what she meant. She said, "On the floor. I kept telling myself you were coming." I didn't say anything. I just looked at her. She said, "I knew you'd figure it out." 31 years. She still believes that. That I'll figure it out. That I'll show up. I held her hand until the yard was completely dark and the neighbor's porch lights were the only thing visible through the trees. That's the only part of this that matters to me now. That I showed up. Everything else. Brendan, the land, the documents, Clint's 2-hour drive for nothing. All of it was just accounting. Painful accounting, but accounting. Helen is home. Helen is okay. That is the only thing I needed to be true. I've thought about that afternoon 100 times since it happened. Not obsessively, I'm not built that way, but the way you turn a stone over in your hand when you're sitting still and something quiet comes back to you. What I keep coming back to is not the anger. It's the 40 minutes. 40 minutes is long enough to make a decision. It's long enough to stand up, walk 20 feet and say, "I think something is wrong." Brendan had that time. He had more than that. And he chose something else. That choice didn't come from nowhere. It came from years of learning that discomfort was someone else's problem to solve, that inconvenience could be waited out, that someone else would handle it. I don't say that to excuse what he did. I say it because I spent a long time asking myself where that instinct came from, and the honest answer is that I helped build it, not on purpose. But I built it. There's something uncomfortable about that kind of honesty. It's easier to be purely the wronged party, and I was wronged. Helen was wronged in a way that I will never fully stop being angry about. But integrity, real integrity, means you hold yourself to the same accounting you hold everyone else to. And the accounting was clear. I had spent years softening every consequence for my son. Every time he came up short, I covered the gap. Every time a door didn't open for him, I used my key. I thought I was giving him a foundation. What I actually gave him was the belief that foundations appear on their own. That's not a lesson you can undo with a conversation. It can only be undone by experience, by standing in a place where the floor you expected isn't there and having to figure out for yourself how to stand anyway. That's what I gave Brendan when I made those calls. Not punishment, not revenge, just the conditions that make real growth possible. I think about resilience differently now than I did at 30. At 30, I thought resilience was something you either had or you didn't, a character trait, like height. Now I think it's something that only develops under friction. You cannot build it in comfort. You cannot hand it to someone. You can only create the conditions where it either grows or it doesn't, and then you wait. I don't know which way it goes with Brendan. I genuinely don't. There's a version of this where the discomfort reaches him and something shifts, and there's a version where it doesn't. Both are possible. What's not possible, what I won't allow, is for me to step in and remove the friction before he's had to actually feel it. That would just be 40 more minutes of waiting for someone else to handle it. What I know is this. The day I walked in and found Helen on that floor, I made a choice too. I chose to stay clear, to stay quiet, to let the weight of what had happened do the work that yelling never could. That was not easy. It took everything I had, but it was the right choice, and I knew it was the right choice, because it came from the same place Helen comes from 31 years of learning that love without standards isn't love. It's just fear wearing love's name. She's okay. We're okay. That's enough for right now.